Tonight, we drift back to the damn heart of Victorian England, an age steeped in crepe veils, black lace grief, and whispers of spirits in the fog. In the fenland village of Brockenford, mourning was not a ritual, but a way of breathing. Yet, one widow refused to dress in black. Eleanor Whitcombe wore white, gliding like a pale flame through a world that demanded shadows. And then she vanished, her cottage door left open to the night, her hearth cold, her wedding veil torn in two upon the floor. The constable called it despair. The villagers called it witchcraft. But in the misted lanes and churchyard paths, they began to whisper a figure at the gate, watching, waiting. She became a legend before she was even laid to rest. The Widow in White, a name carved not on a gravestone, but in fear. And more than a century later, we still cannot answer the question that hovers like breath on glass. What really happened to Eleanor Whitcombe? They found it under a pillow, a letter, yellowed, creased at the edges. Its ink bled in places where tears must have fallen. The handwriting was elegant but frantic, like a hand trying to keep ahead of dread itself. Do not trust a man at the gate. He carries the smell of ash, though he never worked a furnace. I see him, even in the daylight. And if I vanish, tell them it was no accident. Tell them he came for me in the color of mourning. That was the last thing Eleanor Whitcombe, better known in the village as the Widow in White, ever wrote. 3 nights later, her cottage was empty. The door swung open to September wind. The hearth had gone cold, and on the wooden floor lay her wedding veil, shredded down the middle as though by unseen hands. Villagers swore they heard her cries near the marshes. A woman's sobs carried over stagnant water. Others claimed to see a pale figure drifting near the churchyard, barefoot, her gown trailing mud and brambles. The constable insisted she had simply wandered off. A breakdown, perhaps nothing more. But if that were true, why did the men who searched the marshes return trembling, pale as chalk, unable to explain the footprints that stopped abruptly at the edge of the water, or the way their lanterns sputtered and died, one by one in the mist? The Widow in White had been real, flesh and bone, a woman who had lived, loved, and mourned like anyone else. And yet her disappearance was treated less like a crime, more like folklore, a bedtime warning for children, a ghost story whispered over ale. But hidden beneath superstition are traces of something darker, something systematic. Her name was Eleanor, and the evidence suggests she knew she was being hunted long before she vanished. And what we must ask, with trembling hands and sleepless eyes, is simple but horrifying. Who was the man at the gate, and why did no one believe her? The year was 1864, a season in England where death still clung to every parlor and pew. The nation staggered beneath the weight of loss. Widows in their crepe veils filled every churchyard, and the black silhouettes of mourning attire had become a permanent fixture in the streets. Consumption hollowed families. Rail accidents broke men to pieces, and soldiers' names were carved into headstones before their children could even remember their faces. It was an era addicted to grief. Victorians built entire industries from sorrow. Mourning jewelry pressed with locks of the dead's hair. Photographs of corpses propped in stiff family portraits. Seances echoing with desperate knocks in candlelit rooms. If you could sell despair, you were rich. If you could see ghosts, you were famous. And it was in this atmosphere, where superstition bled into daily ritual, that Eleanor Whitcombe's story began to ferment. Her village, Brockenford, lay tucked in the fens of Norfolk, where the land itself seemed to mourn. Fog crawled across the fields and wrapped itself around the cottages, a permanent shroud. Crops struggled in the damp, roofs rotted under the constant drizzle, and boots sank into earth that never quite dried. Even the church bell tolled with a cracked, uneven note, like it too was grieving. To live in Brockenford was to live with half an eye on the grave. Farmers muttered about corpse lights dancing over the marsh, and mothers warned their children never to play after dusk. lest a white lady lure them into the reeds. Everyone claimed to know someone who had glimpsed her, a drifting figure in pale fabric, the embodiment of drowned brides and wronged wives. And then came Eleanor, a widow herself, dressed daily in white instead of the traditional black, a strange, unsettling choice. In a place where everyone clung to customs like lifeboats, she had made herself an anomaly, a disruption, an omen stitched into lace. That decision alone set tongues wagging. But when she began speaking of being followed, of shadows lingering by her gate, the villagers folded her into the very ghost stories they had once sworn were imaginary. She was no longer Eleanor Whitcombe, a woman of flesh and mourning. She had become the widow in white, a symbol before she was a person, a story before she was missing. And in a culture that thrived on grief while refusing to take women's fears seriously, what better place could there be for a predator to move unseen? Eleanor Whitcombe. Say her name slowly, and it feels almost ornamental, like a porcelain figurine on a shelf. And that's how people often spoke of her, delicate, refined, as though she were a decorative object placed on display rather than a woman with blood in her veins. She had been married young at 19 to Captain Thomas Whitcombe, a man twice her age, whose fortunes rose and fell with the East India trade. His death at sea left Eleanor not only widowed but branded. In Victorian England, a woman alone was more suspect than sympathetic. Neighbors muttered that her beauty would bring trouble, that her pale skin and unerringly steady gaze invited whispers of which behind closed shutters. But she wasn't all fragility and ghostliness. Records, letters from her sister, fragments of her diary, reveal a sharp, contrary personality. She read widely, argued with priests, collected stories of local hauntings, and even wrote poetry so bleak it makes Sylvia Plath look like a children's author. "I carry my coffin in my chest," she once scribbled. "Its lid rattles when I speak." When her husband died, she refused black crepe mourning garb. Instead, she appeared in flowing white gowns, trimmed with faint embroidery of lilies and forget-me-nots. She told a neighbor it was not vanity, but a statement. "Black is a prison. I refuse to wear my grief like chains." Imagine how scandalous that sounded in a time when even the color of a ribbon could ruin a woman's reputation. But her eccentricity made her visible, perhaps dangerously so. She was admired by some, despised by others. Men in the village called her untouchable, a mixture of desire and fear. Women, meanwhile, accused her of tempting fate, of summoning death closer with her defiance. Children whispered dares about knocking on her door at night, to see if the widow in white would answer with eyes hollowed by ghosts. And yet, beneath her strange choices, Eleanor seemed desperately lonely. She had no children. No surviving family lived near Brockenford. The only letters she received came months apart, often left unread on her mantle. Her diary entries slipped between fierce independence and aching despair. One day she would declare, "I walk stronger without a man's shadow over me." And the next, "I hear only the hollow echo of my own footsteps." The silence gnaws. She was a contradiction, fragile yet unyielding, tragic yet unafraid to provoke. And contradictions attract predators like blood draws wolves. The man at the gate, the one she wrote of, did not just appear out of nowhere. He chose her. Or maybe he'd been circling all along, waiting for her to drift far enough from society's protection that no one would come running when she screamed. It started with the roses. Eleanor kept a small garden behind her cottage, a patch of roses so obsessively tended it was said she spoke to them as though they were children. The blooms were pale, nearly white, their petals brushing against the fence like whispers. But one morning, she found them hacked to pieces, not clipped, not pruned, mutilated. Their stems were split and twisted, their blossoms trampled into the mud. Whoever had done it hadn't just wanted to destroy her garden. They wanted her to see cruelty made visible. She wrote of it that evening. "The garden is defiled. Whoever did this knew it would wound me. There were footprints in the mud, larger than a woman's, facing my window. The villagers dismissed it. Boys playing a prank, they said. Mischief, nothing more." But then came the second incident. She awoke one night to a rattling at the shutters, not the wind, but a deliberate, steady tapping. When she gathered the courage to fling them open, there was nothing but the fog pressing against her panes. She lit a lantern, and in the beam of its glow she caught something she could not explain. A man's silhouette, brief, fleeting, standing at the gate. He did not move toward her. He did not flee. He simply watched until the mist consumed him, and it escalated from there. Tools missing from her shed, scraps of fabric snagged on the hedgerow that did not belong to her. Once, on a Sunday morning, she discovered her door unlatched, though she swore she had bolted it. On her table lay a single lily, its stem snapped, placed exactly where she always set her diary. The most chilling moment came weeks later, when the village children began taunting each other with a new rhyme. "Widow in white, pale as bone, he waits by the gate till she's alone." How did they know about the man? Who told them of the gate? Or were children, in their cruel clairvoyance, echoing something the adults pretended not to see? By then, Eleanor had begun confiding in the parish priest. His notes, preserved in the church archives, record her pleas. "He is real. I feel him breathing when I sleep. Why will no one believe me?" And then, her final cry for help, the letter under her pillow. The pattern is so dreadfully familiar it makes you want to scream across time. Women naming their fear, men dismissing it as hysteria, until fear itself takes flesh. Eleanor didn't imagine the man at the gate. She documented him. She tried to leave a trail. She knew the end was coming. And 3 nights later, it did. Eleanor's disappearance wasn't a scream-in-the-night drama. It was quieter, meaner, like rot spreading through it until suddenly the floor gives way. On the morning of September 17th, 1864, a milkmaid passed by Eleanor's cottage and noticed the door ajar. No smoke rose from the chimney. No candle burned in the window. Inside, the house was strangely untouched, bed neatly made, boots aligned, a teacup rinsed and inverted on the counter. But then came the veil, her wedding veil, carefully folded for years in a chest, was found slashed into 2 ragged halves on the floorboards. Not stolen, not hidden, displayed like a message. The constable, Henry Gorse, declared a case of nervous collapse. He told villagers she must have wandered into marshes, overwhelmed by grief. But there was no body, no trail, no splash of skirts in the bog, just a footprint. A pair of them, found in the mud near her back gate. One set clearly hers, delicate, narrow. The other, larger, pressed deep, halting mid-stride as though the earth itself swallowed the manhole. When asked about it, Gorse shrugged. Old prints. Farmers, poachers, who knows? He ordered the search called off after 2 days. 2 days. For a missing woman in a village of barely 300 souls. That isn't neglect, that's erasure. And then the whispers began. Children claimed they saw her in the churchyard at night, face veiled, moving among the graves. A shepherd swore he glimpsed her figure drifting near the marsh, hem of her gown trailing mud. Some insisted her ghost sobbed outside their windows, while others accused her of witchcraft, that she had conjured her own vanishing to haunt them. But here's the most unnerving detail. Weeks later, Eleanor's diary resurfaced. It wasn't in her cottage, where the priest and her neighbors had searched. It was found propped against the church doors, as if delivered. Its last entry, dated the night before she vanished, read, "I no longer sleep. I wait. He comes closer. I hear him at the door, though the latch is drawn. When they find me, they must know I did not walk willingly into the dark. So we're left with a tangle of contradictions. A woman too alive on the page to simply fade into folklore. A constable too eager to dismiss. Footprints that end mid-stride. A veil cut in half as if to sever her from her vows, her past, herself. And a community that found it easier to whisper of ghosts than admit one of their own might be a predator. If you can even call it an investigation. What happened in Brockenford was less inquiry, more pantomime, a ritual of official shrugs. Constable Gorse filed a single-sheet report. Widow Whitcombe presumed self-exiled or drowned. That was it. No forensics, no interviews, no attempt to track the footprints in the mud. It was a Victorian equivalent of hitting delete. But outside his laziness, others began stitching their own explanations, like vultures piecing together a corpse from feathers and bones. One theory, Eleanor did wander willingly into marsh, lured by grief. The villagers said she was strange in the head, a woman who flouted mourning traditions, who recited poetry about coffins and shadows. Convenient, isn't it? If she was mad, her words about the man at the gate could be dismissed as delusions. But if she was mad, who then cut her veil? Who left the diary at the church? Another theory, she ran away. To London, to some secret lover, maybe even overseas. A few whispered she had corresponded with a man in the city. Letters no one ever produced, of course. But if she had fled, why leave her most cherished object behind, the veil? Why vanish barefoot, her shoes still by the door? The darker theory, the one everyone pretended not to voice, was murder, not by a stranger, but by someone in Brockenford itself. The man at the gate wasn't a phantom. He was flesh, bone, and breath fogging in the cold night. Who had motive? Jealous suitors? Spurned villagers angry at her defiance? Perhaps even Constable Gorse himself, who seemed oddly invested in silencing the whole matter. The priest who had counseled Eleanor scribbled his own private notes. They were never meant for public eyes, but they survive. She named him. She whispered a name I cannot write here. A man known in the village. She feared him, and yet no one would heed her. If I speak it now, what justice could be done? Why didn't he record the name? Fear? Loyalty? Or was the priest himself complicit, weaving riddles to cover his silence? And then there's a folkloric theory, that Eleanor became what people accuse her of being, that the widow in white they glimpsed in graveyards wasn't memory or metaphor, but her transformed, trapped between life and myth. People pointed to the chill in their cottages, the sudden extinguishing of lanterns near the marsh, the echo of footsteps behind them in the fog. In every theory, two things remained constant. She didn't simply walk away, and she wasn't believed until it was too late. The truth is coiled somewhere between human malice and supernatural dread, and neither option leaves room for comfort. There was one night, one revelation, that cracked the story wide open. If only anyone had been listening. Weeks after Eleanor's disappearance, the church sexton, a dour man named Caleb Moss, stumbled into the tavern pale and shaking, his eyes darting like a hunted animal. He claimed he'd seen her, not drifting in fog, not glowing like a saint in stained glass, but real, flesh, bone, barefoot, stumbling through the graveyard in torn white cloth. He swore she clutched her side as though wounded, leaving smears of dark red on the stone crosses. They laughed him out of the room, called him drunk, but here's where it gnaws at the ribs. 2 days later, Caleb Moss was found hanging from the bell rope in the church tower, his neck bruised, but his feet touching the ground, not high enough to strangle clean. It looked staged, grotesquely so. The coroner declared suicide. The villagers muttered curses. But if you've ever seen a man who wants to die, you know they don't choose to half-hang themselves from a rope they've wrung for 30 years. Someone wanted his death to ring like a warning. That's when Brockenford began to fracture. The tavern whispers curdled into outright paranoia. Some insisted Moss had seen Eleanor's ghost, a banshee caked in grave dirt who punished him for speaking her name. Others muttered darker, that Moss had known the man at the gate, had been part of something vile, and once he spoke out, he was silenced. The priest's notes grow erratic here. His neat hand becomes jagged, desperate. One entry. I fear a covenant among men of this village. She saw something she should not. Her silence was demanded. Her veil cut in warning. When she refused, she was taken. A covenant. Think about that. Not one man. Many. This is the turning point where the story stops being about one vanished widow and becomes about a whole community rotting from within. Because if that dire line is true, if Eleanor named a man known to all, then silence was not apathy, it was complicity. And maybe that's why the widow in white endures. Because every ghost story hides a corpse. And every corpse hides someone who wanted it buried deeper. The mystery stopped being, where did Eleanor go, and became something far more poisonous. How many people already know? Officially, there was no resolution. Eleanor Whitcombe's name slid into parish records with a cold phrase, presumed deceased, body unfound. That's the neat ribbon tied on her disappearance. The bureaucratic burial of a woman who never received a coffin. But the scraps that remain, letters, testimonies, whispers scribbled in margins, point to something far more jagged. First, the diary. Its sudden reappearance at the church was never explained. Was it left by Eleanor herself, escaping briefly before being dragged back? Or by someone who wanted her words preserved, but not her life? Second, the veil. That violent severing, left like a trophy in her cottage, feels less like symbolism and more like signature. A predator saying, she's no longer wife, no longer woman, only mine. Whoever cut it wanted to erase her identity and leave only the legend. Third, the priest's fragmented confession of a covenant, a circle of men bound by silence, either by guilt or blood, a conspiracy in miniature. Did Eleanor stumble into knowledge of their crimes? Smuggling, assault, corruption that made her a liability? Or was she simply too visible, too disobedient? A woman who refused the script of black veils and meek obedience? And then the sightings. They never stopped. For years after her disappearance, villagers reported the figure. Pale gown, hollow eyes, drifting at the marsh's edge. Skeptics call it folklore. Believers insist it was Eleanor, caught between death and denial. But here's the question no one asks. What if those sightings weren't spectral? What if, in the first weeks, some villagers truly saw her, alive, fleeing, injured, and chose to dismiss it as ghostly nonsense rather than admit they had failed her? The lingering questions pile higher than the gravestones. Who was the man at the gate? Why did the priest never write the name she whispered? Did the constable bury evidence? Or simply his conscience? And most damning of all, why did the village, from the very start, find it easier to turn Eleanor into a legend than to demand justice for her as a woman? The widow in white became folklore not because she was unreal, but because folklore is safer than truth. A ghost cannot point a finger. A ghost cannot name names. And perhaps that was the point. Brockenford never recovered, not from the disappearance, not from the whispers that wormed their way into every hearth and every dream. The marsh became taboo. Children forbidden to play there. Farmers refusing to cut reeds after dark. The church bell, once cracked but faithful, was torn down after Caleb Moss's death. They said it rang on its own at night, tolling a funeral no one attended. The legend metastasized. By the turn of the century, Eleanor was no longer Eleanor. She was only the widow in white. Her story was retold in taverns as a cautionary tale for unwed girls. Obey tradition. Wear your mourning black. Don't draw attention, or you'll be taken like she was. The moral was always twisted against her. transforming her defiance into justification for her fate. But underneath the folklore, the shadow of guilt never lifted. Diaries from neighboring villages reveal Brockenford's reputation curdled into something sinister. Travelers avoided the place. Preachers warned of its cursed silence. Even Victorian spiritualists, who flocked everywhere chasing phantoms, refused invitations to hold seances there. One medium famously wrote, "Whatever haunts Effin is not of the dead but of the living, and I do not care to cross its path." And yet, Eleanor's image endured. Painters rendered her as a spectral bride. Folklorists catalog her tale alongside phantom hitchhikers and drowned maidens. To this day, in ghost tours across Norfolk, her name is invoked with shivers. The widow in white, veiled and waiting. But the legacy runs deeper than legend. If you dig into legal records, you'll find a subtle ripple. The year after her disappearance, Parliament pushed for stricter protocols in missing persons cases, especially involving women. Was it coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps Eleanor's case circulated far enough to sting a few consciences in London. Still, the cruelest legacy is this. Eleanor became more powerful dead or half dead than alive. Alive, she was dismissed, ridiculed, ignored, gone. She was unforgettable. And maybe that's what makes her ghost linger. Not because she cannot rest, but because we cannot let her. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Eleanor told us everything. She told us she was watched. She told us she was hunted. She told us that she vanished. It was no accident. She left her fear on paper, in ink for the world to find. And still, she disappeared, and the story was twisted into ghostly entertainment. We are complicit, all of us, across time, because the widow in white isn't just Eleanor Whitcombe. She's every woman whose terror was repackaged as hysteria. Every disappearance turned into folklore because the truth was too ugly, too accusing. We love our ghost stories neat, sanitized, safe behind the veil of the supernatural. But scratch the surface, and you see the fingerprints of real men with real knives, real power, real silence. Sometimes I wonder if Eleanor ever knew, in those last moments, that her name would endure, that she would outlive her captors, her village, her constable, even her priest, that a century and a half later, people who never walked her marsh or touched her veil would still whisper about the widow in white. But it's a hollow kind of immortality, isn't it? To be remembered not as a woman, but as a warning, to have your life reduced to a spectral silhouette drifting at the edge of the fun. And yet, when I read that final diary entry, I can't shake the thought that maybe this is the truest haunting. Not her ghost in the mist, not her gown trailing brambles, but the words she left behind, still rattling like bones across the years. Tell them it was no accident. Tell them, he came for me in the color of mourning. If that doesn't chill you more than any apparition, you haven't been listening. But one detail seldom spoken of survived in the parish archives. A torn slip of paper, found wedged between the last pages of Eleanor's journal, bore only 3 words in her own hand. He still waits. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, unlike the calm reflections before it. No date, no explanation, only that chilling note. And when archivists checked the property where the constable's cottage once stood, they found the initials H.G. carved faintly into the lintel of the door, as if marked there long before his death. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.